How's it going, everybody? Welcome to another Top 10 Most Expensive. This time we're taking a trip back in time to 1995 and looking at the 4th edition expansion. So 4th edition is one that I particularly wanted to look at because I feel that a lot of people who played around this time in this era do tend to have a lot of 4th edition cards. It was a very highly printed set at the time, and just in my experience I seem to see it in quite a few collections throughout the ones that I look at. And 4th edition has it has exactly 378 cards in it, and only 7 of those cards are actually worth $10 or more, despite the fact that it's such an old set. 4th edition was a reprint set, and I believe all of the cards in it were reprints, correct me if I'm wrong. So this is definitely one that is good to know the top 10 most expensive in, especially if you're looking at somebody's collection, because a lot of the cards aren't worth anything. So definitely do keep that in mind. And let's just get right into it. Number 10 on the list is Stasis. So it's a 2-mana enchantment for 1 colorless and 1 blue. And it reads, players do not get an untap phase. During your upkeep, pay 1 blue or destroy Stasis. Now, I imagine their original intention when they printed this card, I believe it was originally printed back in Alpha, was that a player would play Stasis and they would have to tap their 1 blue mana every turn, and the game would totally stall out, but eventually they'd run out of mana. They'd have to sacrifice Stasis, and then the game would continue as normal, but there ended up being a lot of ways to break this card or to kind of go around its drawback. The first example is any creature with vigilance or that doesn't tap when it attacks. Serra Angel is a 4/4 flying angel printed in the exact same set with vigilance, so it combos very perfectly with this card, I should say. Serra Sphinx is the time-shifted version, printed in Planar Chaos, which is in the same color as Stasis, which is nice. Also, Kismet, printed in the same set as well, is a 4-mana enchantment which reads all of target players' creatures, lands, and artifacts come into play tapped. So once you play Stasis, you don't have to worry about their new lands and creatures and whatnot coming into play untapped and having 1 use before they're dissolved. So you can essentially turn it into what would be pretty much a complete lockout once they tap their remaining resources. And Frozen Ether, which is the time-shifted version, also blue and also in Planar Chaos, interestingly. Vidalcan Mastermind, if you want to be really, really dirty, you can pair this card with Stasis. This is a 2-mana, 1/2 creature Vidalcan Wizard, which you can pay 1 blue and tap it to return target permanent you control to its owner's hand. So essentially what you can do is play Stasis, let your opponent skip their untap step, and then after they skip it, you use Vidalcan Mastermind's ability to return it to your hand, and then you just replay it on your turn after you've conveniently untapped all of your stuff. So essentially for an upkeep cost of 3 mana, you can basically completely lock down your opponent, especially if you have Kismet or Frozen Ether in play. And one last thing, I just want to know your guys' opinion on the art in this card. So I really have no idea what's going on. There's like a white ghosty guy with a pointy hat, there's like an art palette, and some sort of fox person, furry question mark, holding a present with a blindfold, and it's night outside. I have no idea what's going on, so if anybody can write a really funny, witty interpretation of what's going on in this art, I will pin your comment. And Stasis costs only around $6 as of the making of this video, so I imagine maybe that's partially due to the fact that it's been reprinted a bunch of times, or that it's a really mean card to play, and people are just nicer than we think they are. I have a feeling it's the first thing I said, but yeah, and also another thing to note is that these card prices are in US dollars and are for specifically cards in near mint condition. At number 9, we have Winds of Change, which is 1 red mana for a sorcery, and it reads, all players shuffle their hands into their libraries and then draw the same number of cards they originally held. So it's sort of a Wheel of Fortune type effect. I would say probably not quite as good as Wheel of Fortune, as Wheel of Fortune allows both players to go back to 7 cards, whereas Winds of Change, you have to essentially use 1 card and then you don't get that card back, so it is card disadvantage, which is something to consider. There is an advantage though, which is that Winds of Change only costs 1 red mana, whereas Wheel of Fortune is 3, and it costs a lot less money. I think the cheapest printing of Wheel of Fortune is like $150. And so the fact that it costs 1 mana means that you can pair it with another spell to play on the same turn a lot easier without it being so mana intensive. So Molten Scythe is one example, a 3-mana sorcery which has basically the same effect as Winds of Change. Each player shuffle their hands in their library and then draw the same amount of cards, but if you have Metalcraft or 3 or more artifacts on the battlefield, then Molten Scythe deals damage to each opponent equal to the number of cards they drew that turn. So if you play Winds of Change first, and then play Molten Scythe for a total of only 4 mana, let's say your opponent had 4 cards originally, they're going to have drawn 4, and then another 4 for Molten Scythe, and so we'll take 8 damage, which is pretty effective. And then one of the craziest, like really devastating combo that I was reading about online is Plagiarize with Winds of Change. So Plagiarize is a 4 mana instant in blue, which reads, until end of turn, if target player would draw a card, instead that player skips that draw, and you draw a card. So if you play Winds of Change, let's say you and your opponent both have 4 cards in your hand, you both would shovel your hands into your libraries, but only you would draw your 4 back, and your opponent would skip all their draws, and they would lose their entire hand, and for every card that your opponent would have drawn, you would get to draw that extra card. So you would draw a total of 8 cards, and your opponent would be left with nothing, which is pretty scary, I think. And it would be a pretty cool combo if you actually managed to pull it off. And then of course it combos with the more obvious options. Nikusar the Mind Razor is a somewhat popular commander general, which deals damage to your opponents every time they draw a card, and Cataract Parasite has a similar effect, dealing damage to opponents whenever they draw a card. So obviously just decent combo potential with Winds of Change, and Winds of Change costs around $7 at the time that I made this video. Not too bad, not too shabby. And the 2 previously mentioned cards were both rares. At number 8, we have another rare. This is Wrath of God for 2 colorless and 2 white mana. It's a sorcery with a very elegant, simple ability, which is to bury all creatures, or it's been errated to now say destroy all creatures and they can't be regenerated. So a really, really classic card. I think it's still extremely useful and relevant. This ability to have such an impact with a symbol. With a simple single card, that's a tough little sentence to say, a single simple card like this, which can destroy so many things in a fell swoop, is very powerful effect, and the fact that it stops regeneration makes it arguably better than Day of Judgment, which is sort of the newer version of this card, newer printing. And Wrath of God, this classic original, also should note, originally printed in alpha, for the 4th edition version will cost you around $9. At number 7 is Meekstone, and this card I'm a huge fan of. I think it's really, really good. It's only 1 colorless mana, and it has a very game-changing effect, which is that no creatures with power greater than 2 untap during their controller's untap step. So, I mean, this is a very, very game-breaking effect for its cost. The fact that, I mean, in Commander there are so many creatures with power 3 or greater, and if you built your deck around this, you can really make it work for you, I guess I should say. For example, a white weenie deck where all of your creatures have 2 power or less could be one really effective way to do it. You can tutor it with Trinket Mage, which is a really nice budget option for increasing the consistency of drawing it. When I say budget, I mean monetary-wise, not mana-wise. And of course combos with anything with Vigilance, just like in the case of Stasis. So Sarah's Blessing is an enchantment that gives all your creatures Vigilance, and Heliod, God of the Sun, is a legendary creature that gives all your other creatures Vigilance, and could also be used as a commander general. So I would think that if I had a Heliod commander deck, I would almost definitely include Meekstone in it. And cards like Blind Obedience and Thalia Heretic Cathar make really good alternatives for Kismet and Frozen Ether because they're lower mana costs, and they have the most important effect, which is that they don't allow your opponent's creatures to untap, whereas Kismet and Frozen Ether are more focused on specifically making your opponent's lands not untap when combined with Stasis. But of course in the case of Meekstone, you don't care about their lands untapping or not, so why not use these options which cost less mana and have interesting other additional effects. There's also a cool card called Retribution of the Meek, which kind of reminded me of Meekstone. Both of these cards, I guess, are kind of the same genre. It's a sorcery for 3 mana, which reads bury all creatures or destroy all creatures without chance of regeneration with power 4 or greater, printed in Visions. And so I kind of think like you could build a pretty cool Meek deck, I guess you could call it, with a lot of small creatures and then these kind of spells and abilities that shut down all the bigger creatures. I think that would be a cool, flavorful deck to build. And we're finally in the double digits. This card will cost you around 10 bucks, Meekstone, as of the making of this video. At number 6 is Lord of Atlantis, an absolute classic, and I think is a nostalgic card for a lot of people. This is one of the printings with the original art, the same art as the Alpha Beta printing. For 2 blue mana, you get a 2/2 creature, which reads all Merfolk, gain Island Walk, and +1/+1, which has now been errated to other Merfolk get +1/+1 and have Island Walk, and the creature type has been changed to a Merfolk itself, which you could argue is better in most cases, because now if you play 2, they will buff each other up, whereas before they wouldn't have buffed each other when the creature type was Lord. And Lord of Atlantis costs 10 bucks, around the same price as Meekstone. At number 5 is Birds of Paradise. So for 1 green mana, you can have a 0/1 flying mana birds. I think the creature type has been changed now, but it used to say mana birds, which is kind of cool about the 4th edition printing. And it can tap for 1 mana of any color. So extremely effective not only for mana fixing, but also for acceleration. Having 3 mana on turn 2 is definitely nothing to scoff at. And is an absolutely classic card as well, included in a lot of green decks, I would say. Has a lot of prints as well. Despite that, it is still worth a decent amount. Another interesting fun fact about this card is that the art, so I've read, was originally commissioned for the card Volcanic Island. So they commissioned the art, and when they got it back, they thought that the focus of the art was too much so on the bird and not enough so on the island. And so they actually created an entirely new card just based off the art that they received. Which, I mean, is kind of understandable. If you pay for art to get made, you don't want it to just get wasted, so why not create an additional card? And then that card just so happened to be a very iconic card for the next 25 years of Magic the Gathering. And Birds of Paradise 4th edition printing will cost you around 11 bucks right now. At number 4 is, I believe, the only uncommon on the list, which is pretty cool, and it's cool that it's so high on the list as well. Strip Mine is a very iconic card, is banned in both Legacy and Vintage, so that does speak a little bit to its power level. So let me just read it to you. It's a land, it can tap for 1 colorless mana, and you can tap and sacrifice it to destroy target land. So this is very, very good effect, and as another testament to how good of an effect it is, you can see throughout the years it kept being sort of reprinted in less powerful versions. In 1997, in the Tempest expansion, Wizards of the Coast, or was it called Garfield Games back then? I can't remember. Released a card called Wasteland, which was basically the same effect as Strip Mine, except it could only kill non-basic lands. Despite that, it still ended up being a very, very highly played card and cost, I think, around 100 bucks at one point, correct me if I'm wrong. And then eventually they made even less powerful versions of that, like Tectonic Edge, Ghost Quarter, Encroaching Wastes, and Field of Ruin. So definitely a testament to Strip Mine's power level. Despite all of that, it only costs around 20 bucks, which does seem like a pretty good deal considering Wasteland I think is still more expensive, and probably the biggest reason for that is the fact that it's banned in Vintage and Legacy. Although Strip Mine is probably the better option if you're playing Commander, it's both cheaper and more effective. And the fact that this is a $20 uncommon means that it's definitely something to look out for in your own collection if you have a bunch of 4th edition cards lying around from back when you used to play, or if you're looking at purchasing somebody else's collection. There is a chance that there might be multiple copies of this card, which could be quite a score. At number 3, we have Land Tax. So Land Tax is a card that I actually talk about in some of my other videos as well, just because it's so good, it's so broken. For only 1 white mana, you can have an enchantment, and well, I'll just read it to you. During your upkeep, if an opponent controls more land than you, you can search your library for not 1, not 2, but 3 basic lands, put them into your hand, and then shuffle your library. And you can do this every single turn that you have less lands than your opponent. So it's just bonkers in my opinion. Like, even if it found 1 land, I feel like it would be not bad for its mana cost. But the fact of the matter is, you can also combo it with cards that benefit from discard effects. So for example, Seismic Assault, I think was the main one that I was reading about, is an enchantment where you can choose and discard a land specifically from your hand to deal 2 damage to target creature or player. So essentially a free shock for every land in your hand. So if you can keep yourself at a state where you have less lands than not just all of your opponents, but at least one opponent, right? So if you're playing a big multiplayer game, only one opponent needs to have more lands than you, then that means every turn you get 3 free shocks, not to mention the fact that you're also thinning out your deck and making it so that you draw more non-lands in the future, and you're pretty much guaranteeing a land drop every turn. So you can see why this card is extremely effective and costs $25 at the time that I made this video. And number 2, we have Sylvan Library. And this was a card that I actually didn't know too much about before I started researching for this video. And especially just the ways in which you can kind of combo it with other cards. But first just let me read it for you for those unfamiliar. It's 1 colorless and 1 green, so a 2 mana enchantment. And it reads, you may draw 2 extra cards during your draw phase. If you do, put 2 of the cards drawn this turn back on top of your library in any order, or pay 4 life per card not replaced. So to simplify this, and this isn't exactly how it works with all the nuances, but basically what it does is allows you to draw 3 cards instead of 1, and then you put 2 of those cards back, or you can keep 2 of them and put 1 back, but you have to pay 4 life, or you can keep all 3 and pay 8 life. So in Commander, that's not actually that big of a deal, considering the fact that you start out with 40 life, and life gain seems to be a little bit easier to come by. But I'll tell you some more reasons about why this card is also really good in a second. First of all, if you use it with cards like Misty Rainforest or the rest of the Zendikar fetch land cycle, or even any of the common fetch lands like Evolving Wilds, or any other way to shuffle your deck really, means that at the point where you end up sort of constantly shifting 1 card to the front and there's 2 cards at the back that you don't really want anymore, you don't really want to draw them, you can just shuffle them away with a fetch land, and that way you have a completely fresh new set of 3 cards to look at for your next turn, which is always very effective. So it's kind of similar to doing this with Brainstorm. And also interestingly, it's not like Ponder where you're just looking at those cards and then putting them back. You're actually technically drawing those cards and then putting them back, so it will trigger effects that check every time you draw a card. So Lore Scale Coatl, for example, is a 2/2 for 3 mana, which gets a +1/+1 counter every time you draw a card. And with Sylvan Library in play, you're drawing 3 cards per turn technically, so Lore Scale Coatl is getting 3 +1/+1 counters every turn. So that's going to be a big snake very quickly. Psychosis Crawler has an effect where whenever you draw a card, each opponent loses 1 life. So once again, just a nice little combination there. Each opponent's going to lose 3 life per turn instead of 1. And then possibly the most broken use of Sylvan Library is with cards that have replacement effects for your draws and turn your draws into something else. So the most famous example I would say would be Abundance. Abundance is a really good card just on its own. It's a 4 mana enchantment which reads, instead of drawing a card, you can choose land or non-land and reveal cards from the top of your library. Until you reveal a card of the chosen kind, put the card into your hand and all of the cards on the bottom of your library in any order. So you're technically not drawing a card when you do this. And on top of that, you get to pick land or non-land, which is just really sweet in general, because let's say you have enough lands, you have enough mana, you can just pick to draw a card that you can cast, pretty much guaranteed. But on top of that, and this is actually a Gatherer on the Ruling, dyslexic, I guess. This is actually a Ruling on the Gatherer, is what I meant to say, if you don't believe me. And if you combine this with Sylvan Library, you actually get to keep all 3 of your draws, because you technically didn't draw those cards before the resolution of, or you didn't draw them at all, and once the resolution of Sylvan Library's effect resolves, then it checks and it sees that you haven't drawn any cards, and so you don't have to pay any life, and you don't have to put any of the cards back on top of your library. So this is super, super powerful, and yeah, the ability to draw 3 cards per turn is definitely nothing to be scoffed at. Tomorrow, Azami's Familiar is 6 mana for a 1/5 legendary, which has the effect that if you would draw a card, you look at the top 3 cards of your library instead, put 1 of those cards into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. So not only do you get 3 cards to keep per turn, but you essentially get 3 Ponders per turn, without the shuffle effect, of course. So you're digging through the top 9 cards of your deck every single turn. So in a combo deck, this would be a really quick way to find your combo pieces, especially in Commander. And just really, really freaking good in general. A couple of other cards that have similar effects are Sages of the Anima, which allow you to find creatures, and the newly printed Underrealm Lich from Guilds of Ravnica, which has a similar effect to Tomorrow, except it puts the other cards into the graveyard instead. So obviously could be really good in a deck that utilizes the graveyard a lot, but also could be really risky because you might deck yourself after enough time. Cards like Words of Worship and Words of Wilding are replacement effects that not only cause you to not draw, but they do something completely different than drawing. So Words of Worship is an enchantment with an ability that you can pay 1 colorless mana to replace your next draw with 5 life. So essentially 3 mana to gain 15 life every turn, and Words of Wilding does the same thing except replaces your draws with 2/2 green bear creature tokens. So for 3 mana you can get 3 2/2s every single turn, which is also very good. Do keep in mind though that you can't use the effect once or twice and still reap the advantage of Sylvan Library's effect, because you will have to put that other card back on top of your library or pay 4 life. You have to basically either use all 3 or don't use any in the turn in order for these to be effective, if that made sense. I hope that made sense. So yeah, so that was a lot to go over about this card, but I definitely wanted to do it justice and show you why this is such a sweet card, all the combo potential, and even the art on this card. I just love the art on this card as well, and I feel like it's a real classic. So Sylvan Library will cost you about $30, and rightfully so, in my opinion. And at number 1, the moment you've all been waiting for is Mana Vault. So a colorless 1 mana artifact, and let me just read you this itty-bitty text here. So Mana Vault does not untap during your untap phase. During your upkeep you can pay 4 colorless mana. If you do untap Mana Vault, and if it remains tapped during your upkeep, it deals 1 damage to you, but most importantly it can tap to add 3 colorless mana to your mana pool. So, and yes, it does not come into play tapped. So let's talk about this a little more, but before we talk about it, how much do you guess that this is going to cost? So if you don't know how much it costs already. Now we'll talk about the synergies of this card and why it's so good. So Dark Ritual is a 1 black mana instant which adds 3 black mana to your mana pool and is widely known as an extremely powerful card. The ability to instantly get 3 mana from 1 is very, very good. Mana Crypt essentially does the same thing, only that it's colorless mana and it's sorcery speed. Of course the cards are different because you get colored mana from Dark Ritual, whereas you only get colorless from Mana Vault? Yeah, I think Mana Vault. But Mana Vault's very nice because it can be included in decks of any color, whereas Dark Ritual can only be included in black decks, which is really cool. Of course the drawback is that if you don't untap Mana Vault later and you're just using it like a ritual, then it is going to deal you 1 damage per turn, which can add up depending on what type of game you're playing. For example, a long commander game can sometimes make a difference. Other things to note is that Voltaic Key is a 1 mana artifact that you can pay 1 and tap it to untap target artifact. So in combination with Mana Vault, this essentially becomes a Soul Ring, and Soul Ring is an incredibly broken card, as I'm sure many of you probably know, and so why not have an additional copy in your deck by utilizing the Voltaic Key plus Mana Vault combo, or really just any other way to untap artifacts or untap permanents is really good with Mana Vaults, because you're just circumventing that 4 mana upkeep cost that you would normally have to pay in order to untap it to just consistently reap the benefits of its 3 mana tap ability. So Unwinding Clock is one example. For 4 mana, it's an artifact that allows you to untap all artifacts you control during each other player's untap step. So you can imagine, especially too, if you have a way to use that colorless mana during your opponent's turn, maybe a reusable activated ability, and if you're playing a multiplayer game, you're going to get 3 mana every single turn with that effect, plus from all the other mana rocks that you have as well. Kiora's Follower is a 2 mana 2/2 which can tap to untap another target permanent, once again just guaranteeing you an extra 3 mana every single turn, which is just crazy. And this card costs around $31. Now I know it's quite similar to Sylvan Library. It is splitting hairs a little bit to say that this card costs more, but I did feel that from all the sources that I looked at on the prices of these cards, I found Mana Vault was generally higher priced than Sylvan Library, although they are similar, but I did have to pick one for first place, and so I thought Mana Vault was deserving of that. Who knows what's going to happen to the prices in the future? Easily one or the other could win out over the other card, but for now, Mana Vault does seem to be slightly ahead of Sylvan Library. So, that about wraps up this video. Was there anything I missed? Definitely let me know in the comments if there was any other synergies or any other reasons that you think the cards that I mentioned are really good and are worth their money. Were there any cards that you don't think are worth their money, or that you think are maybe overpriced? Are there any cards on this list you think are underpriced? Are there any cards in 4th edition in general which you think are underpriced and maybe undiscovered and will end up on this list someday? Definitely let me know in the comments. Always happy to hear your opinions. And yeah, I guess that pretty much wraps up this video. This has been Collectible Squash, and I will see you guys in the next one. Feel free to subscribe.